feel anyone that's been around here for long enough probably realises that hack and slash games are kind of my jam. From character actions to soul-like, RPGs to platformers, if it has you swinging a blade or throwing ludicrous punch combos, probably right up my alley. And I'm always in search for more lesser-known titles, see if there's any diamonds in the rough outside of the monoliths of the genre. So far, really shiny stones at most. And in this search, I remembered a first-party PS3 exclusive that didn't reach the heady heights other Sony games enjoyed, and one I never actually played back in the day as a 360 kiddie, and that game is Heavenly Sword, a 2007 hack-and-slash game from the minds at Ninja Theory, the developers behind games like Enslaved Odyssey to the West and the Devil May Cry reboot, both games that I somewhat enjoyed from a mechanical standpoint, but didn't really care much for narratively. And most recently they've made the Hellblade games that I haven't played, but I have a very rudimentary understanding of. Heavenly Sword fades into Sony's back catalogue pretty fast, with the only acknowledgement of its existence being a poorly received animated movie made in 2014, and the main character's inclusion in PlayStation All-Star Battle Royale. But despite this, Heavenly Sword received platinum status for its sales, and had a sequel in the works for a bit before Sony canned the project. And unlike a lot of games I've previously looked into, it actually received pretty decent review scores. But like everything, I still have to ask why, and if it truly was as good as the scores would say. I am the resident gremlin, the purveyor of the weird, the retro and the forgotten, and today we're looking at Heavenly Sword.
I should not have been.
The story begins at the very end, with our protagonist Nariko facing down an entire army, lamenting her birth. Her people believed in a prophecy that a god would be reborn as a mortal man, one that would unite the disparate clans and usher in an era of peace. But on the year specified, Nariko was born instead, and her clan viewed her as a curse, and after a brief fighting section, she succumbs to the Heavenly Sword, a blade that steals the life of all that wields it. And after Nariko dies, she awakens in what I assume is the afterlife, pleading, demanding that the sword send her back to save her people. And the rest of the game is playing out the events that lead to the final battle. Nariko and her clan have sworn to protect the sword from all that would take it for themselves, as historically wars have been fought simply to claim the blade. However, King Bohan, warlord and tyrant, has hunted her clan into a corner, hell-bent on taking it for himself. With her clan defeated and her father captured, Nariko takes up the sword to save her people, rescue her father, and end Bohan's reign of terror, and all the while knowing the terrible price she must pay. As you can probably guess, Heavenly Sword is a lot more story heavy than most of the games I've looked at previously. Indeed, the 7th generation was where more studios caught on to the fact that they could make more compelling plots than a loose rationale for why the game is even taking place. Deeper stories existed before this point, yes, but they were more outliers than the norm. That said, I honestly think this isn't for the better with this game. While it goes for deeper themes that we'll get to later, it follows the tried and true plot progression of Nariko setting off to save her people, working her way through Bohan's minions in sequence before facing off with Bohan himself. A solid framework, but also very generic. It doesn't even really try to deviate or build on that either. It's more than content to stick with the tried and true for going anything resembling intrigue. There's a point in Chapter 2 where the game tries to pull a twist, revealing that Shen, Nariko's father, tried to kill her when she was young. However, the game had already outlined the hefty amount of tension between the two characters, so rather than being a shocking revelation, it's met with a response more akin to, yeah, that makes sense. How they handle the story isn't bad inherently, but when you have lofty themes you want to explore, you probably want to develop it a bit more than not at all. Another issue Heavenly Sword suffers from is its pacing is pretty awful in so many regards that it's kind of baffling. And the problem is really twofold. Firstly, chapter length. This game is around 6 to 7 hours long, split into 6 chapters, making each of them about an hour in length. Why is this an issue? Well, to put it simply, an hour level is a long time for any game, but for a hack and slash game, it is an eternity. Another thing is that in a lot of games with longer stages, you typically travel through different locales, change up the scenery a bit. In Heavenly Sword, basically every stage is in the same corridor or general area, which makes everything feel like it's going by much slower. The closest we get to a change in scenery is the middle of Chapter 4, where it moves from the ancient ruin to a funny little natural stone bridge sat slap bang in the middle, which is there for maybe 5 minutes before we get back to the same drab colour scheme we've been dealing with the entire game. The length is also partly due to the combat, but that's a kettle of fish we'll get into later. Secondly, the game is filled with bizarre cuts, where you'll be doing something in one scene and the game will cut away to a completely unrelated scene for a bit, just to drop you back to where you were before. And it does this constantly, with the worst offenders probably being Chapter 3, where it flits between the arena and whatever Kai's doing over and over in the space of an hour, and possibly most egregiously Chapter 2. First time, it abruptly cuts just before Nariko frees her clansmen to Bohan's inner circle, doing nothing much above reinforcing that Bohan might be cartoonishly evil. And then later on, when it cuts to an elongated shooting escort section in the middle of a boss fight. And this isn't a quick section, this is a 10-minute interlude. Man, the fight with Whiptail is a mess of weird cuts. At the start, the arena goes from being bone dry to flooded with no actual explanation as to how, and then at the end, goes back to being bone dry and Bohan is there gloating out of nowhere. Do you know how I describe this? So the game is shot like a movie. You know how there will be a pivotal moment in the plot, or there's a pitched fight between the hero and the villain, and it will cut away to another character doing something equally as important or in their own fight, before cutting back to further in the first pivotal moment? Well, Heavenly Sword doesn't do this. It cuts right back to where it left off, making the story bounce back and forth along the timeline. And this wouldn't actually be too bad if they didn't also have to account for gameplay, which turns a 2-minute cutaway into closer to 15. You can't have this both way, game. Okay, done with structure, let's talk themes. The game's major theme is prophecy and the dangers of blind faith. As mentioned previously, Nariko being born a girl was seen as a portent of doom for her people, believing that she had been born in place of the reincarnated god. For this, her entire clan treated her like crap, as if her mere existence revolted them. Her father, the clan's leader, acts distant, bordering on callous towards her, and let's not forget that he tried to kill her as a baby, taking the belief that she was an affront to the prophecy. And the game treats them as being painfully wrong for treating Nariko the way they do, and they absolutely are, but at the same time they also aren't wrong about the prophecy, because it was true, they just took it far too literally. Because Nariko does usher in an era of peace, does unite the tribes, she just wasn't a man. For a bit I was on the fence if this fulfilled the theme of blind faith being dangerous, and I've come to the conclusion that sort of yes. Because while they were right about the prophecy as a whole, they got the details wrong and it led to the ostracization of their chosen one through constant abuse over decades. But this leads me to something that the game does that I really don't like, and it's that Nariko feels like she has very little agency and kind of exists just to suffer. What I mean is that she doesn't have much say in how the story develops. Not really. Events transpire and she's just dragged along for the ride. To further clarify with examples, she is perpetually in a state of have to. Your dad's been captured and you're surrounded by an enemy. You have to take up the sword to survive. Have to save your clansmen. Have to save your dad. Have to get the sword back. Even right at the end, spoilers by the way, she ascends to godhood after telling the sword that it needs her people more than they need it. She still does it because she literally has no choice if she wants to protect everyone, no matter how the narrative tries to convince you otherwise. And of course, the suffering. Nariko as a character is just kind of the narrative's whipping girl. The treatment of her people, the weird sexual advances from Bohan, and especially the sword. The whole dying thing aside, at the end of each chapter it cuts back to the metal as hell afterlife, where Nariko spends the whole time begging the sword for assistance and breaking down about her failings. All while never breaking eye contact with the player, which is just unnerving. The point is, it feels designed, not uncommon among AAA games with female protagonists, to instill an urge to protect the female protag in the player, despite how capable they actually are, almost as a substitute for actual character development. And what's with this game's tone? It does all of this, throws Nariko and Kai through the metaphorical ringer physically and emotionally, and then has some weird comical scene with the villains just being a bunch of goobers. It tries to have this air of seriousness with Nariko, and then in the same breath has something slapstick happen, which is made worse by the pacing. They just feel out of place. The story isn't bad. Basic, but not bad. It's everything else that drags way down to something only borderline passable. And no amount of Andy Serkis is going to fix that, but by God does he try. On the surface, Heavenly Sword has the classic hallmarks of a hack and slash game. Light attacks, heavy attacks, and combos that combine the two. We have a block that is performed by not doing anything, the second time this has come up when doing these reviews now, and it's still a terrible concept. After blocking a hit, you can use triangle to perform a counter that instantly kills the enemy. For better or worse, the game has a fixed perspective, which frees up the R-stick to be a dedicated dodge tool. A bit of an odd choice, made no better by the lack of iframes, but a novel idea regardless. If you get knocked into the air, the game has a recovery move that allows you to counter the enemy that launched you, staggering them for free damage. Then weirdly the game has no jump button, instead choosing to have all but very specific moves be entirely ground based. When you get the titular Heavenly Sword, you gain access to 3 different stances: speed, power, and the oddly named ranged. The first 2 are pretty self-explanatory, but it's worth mentioning that speed is only marginally faster than power, whereas power deals a lot more damage than speed. And range is kind of just utility. Due to having very low damage, its only real purpose outside of boss fights is clearing space in the more hectic encounters, and launching enemies to be hit with the really unintuitive aerial combos. This is 100% the precursor to the DMC reboot's Angel and Demon weapon mechanic, and it's good to see that they've improved quite a bit in the 6 years between these releases, but they also didn't figure out that lock-on mechanics exist in that time. Finally, we have the Superstar move that can be performed by pressing circle near an enemy after the bar has been filled, making Noriko do a stylish insta-kill move on that target, typically by slamming their head into the ground and stomping on their balls, with the added effect of knocking everyone around you on the ground, letting you also perform a ground insta-kill on them. It's a very powerful tool indeed. With the basics of the combat system covered, let me explain now why I fucking hate this game's combat system. Firstly, enemies in Heavenly Sword can block and will block a lot, taking no damage and wasting a lot of time. Thankfully, most games of this type have tools to break guards, and this is no exception, as there are block breaker combos in the combo list. If you guess there's something wrong with these for me bringing them up after complaining about the blocking enemies, then you'd be absolutely right. Because it's not the combo that breaks the block, it's the last hit of the combo. Meaning you have to go through the entire move to open the enemy up, made all the worse by the fact that Noriko does this really long flourish after most guard breaks, significantly lowering the window you have to hit the target and unload a combo into. You also can't animation cancel in any way, so you're locked into this flourish, potentially leaving you open to attack. Someone in the audience is probably suggesting power stance. Surely that breaks block, right? Wrong again. All power stance really does is hit harder. It suffers from the exact same issue as the speed stance, so guard breaking is absolutely crap. But maybe the game wants you to try and rely more on counters, kind of like Assassin's Creed's combat. A good guess, but also no. Because for whatever reason, the counter seems to be the antithesis of how the rest of the game works, whilst also being basically mandatory. Firstly, the counter timing is odd. Rather than as the attack lands, it's just after it lands, but in a very specific instant after. Insanely specific, because it feels like you're doing the same timing, but not getting the counter because you were a millisecond out. Which really doesn't help when the bosses are heavily reliant on you performing this counter to actually deal damage, because you sure as hell don't have time to block break combo before they recover. Secondly, in general combat, enemies also have stances and can either attack in speed or power, which can only be blocked and therefore countered in the matching stance. However, multiple enemies can attack at once in different stances, meaning blocking one gets you hit with the other, so your only option is to dodge, meaning the counter is completely unusable. But possibly the worst thing about it though is how it interacts with the sword meter, the gauge for how well you're playing the game. You know how other games in the genre reward you for proficiency? Devil May Cry has the style rankings, Bayonetta has end of battle rankings, and Ninja Gaiden rewards you with not dying? Well, think of the sword meter as like that, but also not that and completely arbitrary. The sword meter is increased by raising your combo, banking progress in increments of 5 and gaining more progress with each subsequent step. The counter nets a solid 10, which is really high, but the issue is that you can't reaction parry all that well with these massive skirmishes, and just waiting for the attack kills the combo. But so does bouncing off blocking enemies. But parrying also removes the enemy from combat, lowering the overall amount of meter you can get. You're hearing me right, using counter being efficient actually hurts your progress. And since these combos are locked behind this mechanic, you are completely disincentivized from doing this. Unironically, the easiest way to fill this combo is to just use the aerial recovery move, because it does sod all damage and grants you 6 combo a time. And if it sounds really counterintuitive to get hit to build combo, you are absolutely 100% correct. All in all, the combat is not fluid in the slightest, and completely misses the catharsis of mastery that other games of the genre are built around. And that's the good part of the combat. There's also the shooting sections. Once or twice per mission you will be given either a cannon or swapped to playing as Kai, and the game turns into the worst third-person shooter you've ever played. The cannon and the crossbow can be fired normally, but have god-awful accuracy. The reason for this is because the game wants you to use its patented aftertouch system, where you control the trajectory of your shots with the 6-axis. For those not in the know, 6-axis was a controller gimmick Sony pushed really hard in the early days of the PS3, using the gyros in the controller for very basic motion controls. The problem there is that the controller needs to be held flat and tilted around a lot, making it really uncomfortable beyond 1 to 2 minute stints. Heavenly Sword expects you to do it for 10 to 15 minutes, and because it's 6-axis, it's also extremely inaccurate and an absolute pain in the ass to get to go where you want it to. Especially because how oddly precise the hitboxes are, especially if you're going for full meter in the Kai sections, because you have to headshot and that target is really bloody tiny. But at the same time, it might actually be one of the best 6-axis games, purely because you can turn it off. The difference between doing this, with and without, is like night and day, making the aiming much more responsive and further cementing my belief that 6-axis was always a terrible idea. Switching it off doesn't make the puzzles any better though. Well, insofar as throwing a shield to the gong can be considered a puzzle. The reason switching 6-axis off doesn't help here is simply because almost all of these gong switches require throwing the shield from a fixed camera perspective, which makes the starting trajectory really hard to pass and therefore makes piloting it into the gong a ball ache. Not helped by how many require ricochet shots. There is also legitimately one that requires you to mash a switch for like 10 seconds to raise a statue, pick up the shield from a very specific interact prompt, and then just tossing it, hoping the angle is shallow enough to hit the statue, but sharp enough that it will bounce off towards the gong, because you get one chance at it, and if you miss, it's back to cranking. It's absolutely exister-pad runtime, and you cannot convince me otherwise. And finally, we get to something much worse than the 6-axis. QTEs. Because of course a game from the start of the 7th generation is going to be stuffed to the gills with quick-time events. Now, I've somewhat mellowed on QTEs since my younger days, but the ones in this game are just awful, because they genuinely feel like you have to know what the prompt is going to be to pass them. You're given about a second to hit the right button, not helped by the motion blur and the really inconsistent frame rate. And then you also have to deal with the QTEs themselves being inconsistent. As in, sometimes failing the QTE is fine, and the sequence will continue to the next, or put you in a recovery QTE, and then sometimes you just die. And knowing which ones is which is solely a matter of memory. And then you have to consider that most of the bosses in this game require you to complete a QTE to move to the next phase, and if you fail, the boss regains health. Or you just die, and it's up to you to figure out which ones. QTEs are a very simple way to end the action or to do a cool action sequence without just doing a straight up cutscene. But the way they play out in Heavenly Sword is really confusing and extremely unintuitive. Looking at a lot of the more favourable reviews this game has garnered, they're very heavy on the praise for this game, on both the story and the gameplay, and I really have to ask why. I am acutely aware I have the unmatched power of hindsight, but this game really doesn't do anything particularly groundbreaking or altogether that good. The combat is exceptionally awkward, with systems feeling at odds with each other. as well as missing not only the basic quality of life systems from its contemporaries, but from games from the beginning of the 6th generation. I'm all for going it alone and doing your own thing, but ignoring 5+ years of improvements and innovation feels akin to hubris coming into the action game space. And the implementation of QTEs and 6-axis just feels very slapshot, like it was an afterthought more than something the game was designed for. As for the story, it's generic, it's forgettable, and while it does have some relatively interesting ideas going for it, it is also heavily marred by wild tonal shifts and bizarre pacing that is somehow so breakneck that the plot has no time to really develop anything interesting, but also so laboured that sections feel like they're dragging. I will be fair to say this was Ninja Theory's second ever game, and was on a system that was notoriously hard to develop for, and that while personal feelings differ, their subsequent releases are leaps and bounds better. But for a game on its own merit, Heavenly Sword is a rather hellish experience. What do you guys think? Do you feel the same, or do you think I'm being a bit too mean? Let me know in the comments, leave a like and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. I am the Resident Gremlin, and I'll see you next time.